When a prideful millionaire brings his humble assistant to his ex-fiancee's wedding in a calculated move for revenge, the unexpected twists that follow reveal secrets, lies, and a transformation that money could never buy. Who will come out on top in this battle of hearts and egos? Christopher Hayes was a man who seemed to have it all. To the outside world, he was the real estate mogul surrounded by luxury and power. But anyone who looked closely could see something unsettling, an emptiness no mansion or successful deal could fill. The humiliation of losing Evelyn, his ex-fiancée, to a rival wasn't just a wound to his pride, it was a constant reminder that beneath the fortune was a broken man. And now, the twists of his past weighed on him like a burden he didn't know how to carry. On the other side of the spectrum, Abigail Turner's daily life was marked by completely different challenges. She worked hard as a design assistant in a company where elitism seemed to drip from the walls. Abby knew she didn't fit in with her colleagues, clad in designer clothes and armed with polished conversations. Her practical and straightforward demeanor made her feel out of place. Yet, day after day, she kept going, carrying not only the weight of others' expectations but also her own doubts about the future. Christopher's life, full of money and status, wasn't so different from Abby's in the ways that truly mattered. Both were trapped in realities that didn't make them happy, shaped by the lies they told themselves. Christopher believed that success could heal his wounds, while Abby convinced herself that her humility was a barrier rather than a strength. Neither of them knew their paths were about to collide in the most unexpected way. The invitation to Evelyn's wedding landed like a sucker punch. To Christopher, it wasn't just a social event, it was a cruel reminder that he'd been replaced, and worse, that the world knew it. He needed a plan, something to prove he'd moved on. But his wounded pride turned any solution into an obsession. The idea of bringing someone who represented his evolution started to take shape, though he wasn't sure exactly how. Abby, on the other hand, didn't have time to think about luxurious weddings or hidden vendettas. Her focus was on paying overdue bills and navigating her toxic work environment. She had no idea she was about to be swept into a whirlwind of twists and power plays where she'd have to fight not to lose herself. Their world seemed as far apart as possible, but life has a curious way of weaving together stories that, at first glance, have nothing in common. Christopher's days were filled with meetings, high-stakes decisions, and strategic planning. But at night, the silence of his lavish penthouses was deafening. He avoided thinking about the past, about the lies he told to justify losing Evelyn. Deep down, he knew his relentless pursuit of validation had less to do with her and more to do with a void within himself. A void he hadn't yet realized money could never fill. Meanwhile, Abby endured the small humiliations of daily life at work. Her colleagues saw her as someone who would never reach the status required to be taken seriously. But what no one noticed was the resilience she hid behind her quiet smile. Despite everything, she still believed, however faintly, that she could transform her life. She just didn't imagine it would come in such an abrupt and uncomfortable way. Christopher and Abby's lives, so different on the surface, were on the verge of colliding with the force of a storm. He, consumed by his obsession to prove he'd moved on from the past. She, fighting for a foothold in a world that didn't seem to have room for her. The pieces were beginning to move, though neither of them realized they were being drawn into a larger game than they could anticipate. Christopher's facade of control and power was beginning to crack. His team noticed his restlessness, but no one dared to ask questions. Abby, exhausted by her relentless routine, had no idea that an offer for a fresh start was waiting just around the corner. A chance encounter, an unexpected opportunity, and both their fates would be irrevocably altered. This was just the beginning of something that would change their lives forever. Then came the pivotal moment, the one where the past, the lies, and the weight of money would converge into a new story to be written. Christopher and Abby's lives, each marked by their own secrets and scars, were about to intertwine. But what would it mean for them? And what price would they pay for stepping into this dangerous game? The invitation to Evelyn's wedding arrived discreetly but with the impact of an earthquake. Christopher found the envelope on his desk, nestled between million-dollar contracts and financial reports. His fingers hesitated before opening it, as if he already knew it contained a cruel reminder of his past. When he finally did, his eyes locked on the date and location of the event. It was official, Evelyn had moved on, and high society wouldn't just hear about it, they would witness it. His pride roared like a wounded beast. He needed a solution, something grand, a twist that would restore his power in everyone's eyes. The idea started as a whisper in his mind, growing until it fully formed. He would bring a date. But not just anyone. Someone who symbolized his evolution, someone who could be living proof that he had won, not lost. He didn't want a well-known name or a celebrity, that would be too obvious. No, he needed something more strategic, a choice that exuded authenticity and intelligence. That was when his eyes landed on Abby, almost by accident, as she delivered some documents in the conference room. There was something about her, something genuine that didn't exist in his world of masks and lies. Abby was focused on her work when she received the message to meet Christopher in his office. She found it odd but didn't dare question it. When she entered, she was met with his piercing gaze, one that made her feel uneasy. He was intimidating in a way few could be. Christopher wasted no time on pleasantries. He laid out what he needed. She would accompany him to Evelyn's wedding. "You have something they don't," he said. But the way he assessed her made her feel more like a piece in a game than a person. Abby's initial reaction was disbelief. He wanted her to pretend to be someone she wasn't, just to satisfy his wounded ego. She wasn't naive. She knew that agreeing to something like this would be akin to signing a dangerous contract. "Why me?" she asked, defiant. Christopher only smiled, as if the answer were obvious. But deep down, he was also taking a big gamble. It was a risk to bring someone from outside his world, but maybe, for that very reason, it was the perfect choice. While Christopher tried to convince her, Abby reflected on her own situation. The debts were piling up, and she knew she needed an opportunity to stand out at work. Even so, there was something humiliating about being used as a weapon in a battle of egos. "You'll be compensated, of course," he added, almost as a final bait. The money wasn't what motivated her, but the chance to gain visibility could be decisive. It was a dilemma. And the more he spoke, the more Abby felt she was being pulled into something far bigger than she had anticipated. Christopher was also wrestling with his own doubts. He knew it wasn't fair to put Abby in this situation, but he justified it to himself by believing she would benefit just as much as he would. His wounded pride clouded his judgment of right and wrong. He didn't see Abby as a complete person, only as a solution to a problem. Yet, there was something about her determination that intrigued him. He began to realize that maybe she was more than just a pawn in his game. When Abby finally accepted the invitation, she did so reluctantly. "I'll go, but on one condition: I won't pretend to be something I'm not." Christopher agreed, though he knew it would make things more complicated. He needed her to fit perfectly into the event, and that meant molding her to the world he knew so well. Abby, on the other hand, felt like she was walking into enemy territory but decided she would do it on her terms. The two stood on opposite ends of an unsteady bridge, trying to figure out how to cross it without falling. Christopher saw the wedding as an opportunity for revenge, while Abby began to sense that her involvement might carry more weight than she had imagined. The meeting of two such different people was about to become the starting point for a series of twists no one could predict. Evelyn had no idea that her wedding would ignite something much larger. While Christopher planned his grand entrance, Abby prepared to face a world of opulence and power plays. Both were about to learn that in situations like these, nothing is as it seems, and the true impact of their choices would only come to light later. Abby stared at Christopher with a mix of shock and disbelief. He had to be joking, right? The idea of accompanying him to Evelyn's wedding sounded like something out of a cheap soap opera, where a humiliated millionaire cooked up a revenge plot. "I'm not that kind of person," she replied, crossing her arms in an attempt to contain her indignation. She knew that accepting meant submitting to a power game that wasn't hers and, worse, putting everything she'd built at risk. Abby refused without hesitation and began to leave, but Christopher wasn't someone who gave up easily. "Wait," he said, his voice firm but almost pleading. He wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially from someone like Abby, so far removed from the world he controlled. He pressed on, framing the proposal as a unique opportunity. The word money slipped into his pitch like an irresistible lure. but Abby simply rolled her eyes. For her, it wasn't about money, it was about dignity. Being used to prove something to an ex-fiancé felt like the height of humiliation, and she was certain nothing could make her change her mind. But night came, and with it, Abby's usual worries. The stack of overdue bills on her table served as a cruel reminder of her reality. Her assistant's salary barely covered the essentials, and the idea of giving her career a boost with unexpected visibility began to gnaw at her thoughts. As much as she didn't want to admit it, Christopher's proposal had a deeper appeal, the chance to prove to herself that she could be more than others expected. To be seen, to be heard, maybe it was worth the risk. Meanwhile, Christopher grew impatient. He had seen Abby's potential but also noticed the hesitation in her eyes. Part of him admired that it wasn't something he encountered often in his circle, where people were willing to do anything for a slice of his success. But another part, the prideful part, couldn't stand the idea of failure. He needed her to agree, not just for the plan to work but because something about her challenged him in ways he didn't yet understand. The next morning, Abby showed up at his office, her eyes tired but her stance resolute. "I'll do it," she said before Christopher could begin to argue. "But let me be clear, I'm not changing who I am to please anyone." He smiled, satisfied but also surprised. Few people dared to set conditions for him. From that moment on, the game was on, and both of them knew it wouldn't be easy. The wedding would only be the beginning of a minefield of challenges. Abby's decision wasn't made without doubts. Questions gnawed at her constantly. What was she getting herself into? Christopher, with his ever-confident demeanor, seemed unshakable, but Abby knew there was more beneath the surface. And it was this suspicion that made her wonder if she was stepping into territory far more dangerous than she imagined. She didn't have answers yet, but it was too late to back out now. Christopher, for his part, felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He wouldn't admit it, but Abby's agreement meant more than he expected. There was something about her authenticity that drew him in, something he couldn't replicate no matter how much money he had. But he also knew taking her to the wedding was a gamble. The elite didn't forgive missteps, and Abby was both his greatest asset and his biggest risk. As Abby began to process what she'd agreed to, Christopher started planning his next steps. He knew he'd need to prepare her to face that world, and it would take more than fancy clothes and polished manners. She would need confidence, something he knew he couldn't just buy. But was it possible to shape someone for his world without erasing what made them unique? Christopher was about to find out. Abby braced herself for what was to come but couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind Christopher's insistence. Was it just his wounded pride? Or was there something deeper at play? She didn't know, but she promised herself she'd face whatever came her way with her head held high. Little did she know that by accepting the invitation, she was opening the door to a whirlwind of twists that would not only change her life but also redefine who she was. Evelyn had no idea what was coming. To her, the wedding was the closing chapter of her story with Christopher. But the steps he and Abby were taking at that moment were laying the groundwork for a new narrative, one no one could have anticipated. The event was drawing closer, bringing with it challenges and secrets that both would have to confront. Christopher wasted no time. If Abby was going to be his date for Evelyn's wedding, she had to be prepared to face the ruthless world of the elite. He hired the best experts in etiquette, fashion, and social behavior. "This isn't just an event," he said with his usual arrogance. "It's a battle, and you need to be ready." Abby, reluctant but pragmatic, knew he was right. What she didn't expect was how much the process would make her question her own identity. After all, being molded to fit into a world where she never belonged was a challenge that shook her to her core. The first session was a disaster. Abby arrived with her usual confident posture and defiant gaze, but the etiquette instructor quickly dismantled her composure, pointing out every mistake in her gestures and speech. "You have an interesting presence, but you need to learn how to control it," he said. For Christopher, watching this was equal parts entertaining and frustrating. He wanted Abby to stand out, but not at the expense of the authenticity that had drawn him to her in the first place. Yet he didn't know how to convey that to her. As the days went on, Abby started to catch on. Not because she wanted to change, but because she understood that she needed to play the game to achieve what truly mattered. A better future for herself. With every step forward, choosing the perfect dress or rehearsing polished conversations, she felt as though she was stepping into foreign territory. There was something fascinating about the way that world worked, but also something profoundly irritating. Watching from a distance, Christopher began to admire the way she tackled each obstacle head-on. Despite the constant criticism, Abby found an unexpected ally: Margot, the stylist Christopher had hired. Margot was a seasoned woman with a sharp eye and a soft heart she only revealed to those who earned it. "They think they can transform you, but real strength comes from who you already are," Margot said while adjusting the hem of a dress. Those words stuck with Abby, becoming a sort of mantra amidst the whirlwind of changes and expectations. Meanwhile, Christopher wrestled with his own dilemmas. Watching Abby transform made him reflect on how he had shaped himself to fit into the business world and the elite society he ruled. The lies he had told himself about who he needed to be were now mirrored in her process. He wouldn't admit it even to himself, but every step Abby took made him confront something deeper. Maybe she wasn't the only one who needed a coach? Maybe he needed to relearn who he was too. Between rehearsing refined conversations and making last-minute adjustments, something began to shift in their dynamic. Christopher, who had initially treated Abby as a project, started noticing the little things he hadn't before. The spark in her eyes when she mastered something new, the way she smiled, even when exhausted, at the end of a tough day. It was as if, with every training session, he saw less of the pawn in his plan and more of the person behind the facade. It scared him, but it also intrigued him. On the other hand, Abby started to realize that Christopher wasn't as impenetrable as he seemed. There were moments when he looked at her in a way that made her question his intentions. He was rigid, yes, but he also seemed genuinely invested in her progress. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked one evening during a preparation session. Christopher hesitated, as though the question hit on something he didn't know how to articulate. "Because I need this to work," was all he managed to say. As the big day approached, Abby began to feel the weight of expectations pressing down on her. She had been molded and trained, but she still wondered, would it be enough? Christopher, on the other hand, was more nervous than he cared to admit. He didn't know what to expect from Evelyn, or from himself. But one thing was certain: Abby was already so much more than he had planned for. And that was both a strength and a threat to everything he thought he wanted. Their relationship was evolving, even if neither of them wanted to admit it. Every shared moment brought new layers of understanding but also new emotional barriers. Evelyn's wedding would be a proving ground, not just for Christopher's plan but also for the bond that was beginning to form between him and Abby. Were they ready? Or were they simply heading toward something they couldn't control? Evelyn's wedding was a spectacle straight out of a movie. The reception hall was like a living masterpiece, with shimmering chandeliers, tables adorned with extravagant floral arrangements, and a sea of guests dressed as the best versions of themselves. When Christopher and Abby entered, all eyes turned to them. Abby, dressed in an elegant navy silk gown that Margot had described as flawless, held her head high but could feel the weight of hundreds of scrutinizing gazes. Christopher, on the other hand, appeared in control, though Abby knew it was just a facade. The tension was palpable. Evelyn was as stunning as ever, but her reaction to seeing Christopher with Abby was somewhere between surprise and disdain, masked by a rehearsed smile. She approached them, greeting them with the poise of someone who had mastered the game. "What a pleasant surprise, Christopher. And you brought a friend?" she asked, her eyes scanning Abby from head to toe. Before Christopher could respond, Abby, with a controlled smile, said, "A pleasure to meet you, Abby Turner. And you must be Evelyn, correct? The dress is wonderful. It perfectly matches the classic tone of the decor." It was a masterstroke. Christopher watched Abby with restrained admiration. Not only had she endured the initial impact, but she had also gained ground. Evelyn seemed thrown off but quickly recovered, throwing subtle jabs that only Abby seemed to catch. The game of provocations was in full swing, and while Christopher was impressed by Abby's performance, he began to feel the pressure of the environment. Every glance or smile from Evelyn dragged him back to the past, to the memories of his humiliation. Yet Abby stood there, a solid presence he hadn't expected to rely on so much. As the evening progressed, Abby navigated the event as if she were born for it. She engaged with executives, socialites, and investors, her eyes shining with a mix of genuine curiosity and sharp wit. It wasn't just about impressing anyone. She was learning, absorbing every detail of a world that had always seemed out of reach. From a distance, Christopher watched, torn between pride and an unfamiliar emotion he couldn't quite identify. Beneath all the strategy, he began to see something more in Abby, a strength he himself lacked. Evelyn, noticing her provocations weren't landing as intended, decided to press Christopher's sore spots. At a strategic moment, she approached him, isolating him from Abby. "You know, Christopher," she began, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "it's nice to see you've moved on. Though, I must say, you've always had a talent for putting on a show." Christopher knew exactly what she was doing, but he couldn't stop the wave of anger and insecurity her words stirred. He had orchestrated everything to avoid this moment, yet here he was, vulnerable once again. From a distance, Abby noticed the tense exchange between Christopher and Evelyn. Something was wrong. She didn't know exactly what, but her instincts told her now wasn't the time to keep her distance. She approached discreetly, interrupting the conversation with a polite smile. "Christopher, you promised to introduce me to that investor you spoke so highly of. I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity." Her timing was so precise that even Evelyn had to mask her frustration. Christopher, on the other hand, felt an unexpected wave of relief. Abby wasn't just an ally, she was his fortress. The rest of the evening unfolded with moments of high tension and small victories. Abby began to see just how much Christopher hid behind his armor. He wasn't just a proud man, he was someone scarred by deep wounds. It made her question why she had gotten involved in this plot in the first place. Perhaps there was more to uncover than she had initially thought. At the same time, she knew this wasn't her battle, or was it? When the event finally ended, Christopher and Abby left the hall in a silence heavy with emotion. Christopher looked exhausted, though his posture maintained the dignity he so valued. Abby, on the other hand, felt conflicted. She had faced something that intimidated her, but now she had the sense that it was only the beginning. As the car carried them back, Christopher broke the silence. "Thank you for today. You were incredible." Abby simply nodded, unsure how to respond. Something had shifted between them, but neither knew exactly what. As they crossed back into their separate realities, both carried more questions than answers. What did all of this mean? Christopher knew there was something about Abby he couldn't ignore, but he feared what it might mean. Abby, meanwhile, felt as though she had stepped into a game far bigger than she had anticipated, but something within her was starting to awaken. It felt as if the wedding had only been the prologue to something much larger, something still waiting to unfold. Back to their routine after the wedding, the silence between Christopher and Abby was louder than any argument. Something had changed that night. Abby, despite impressing the elite, couldn't shake the image of the pain she'd seen in Christopher's eyes during his conversation with Evelyn. Beneath the pride and commanding posture, there was a wounded man. "Why did you let her get to you like that?" she finally asked, breaking the silence during a casual meeting. Christopher didn't answer immediately, averting his gaze as though the words were dangerous traps he couldn't risk setting off. Christopher wrestled with the memories of the past that Evelyn had brought back. He knew the image he'd tried to project at the wedding wasn't real, it was just a mask to cover his humiliation. Abby, with her blunt honesty, asked questions no one else dared to. "I've lost everything once, Abby," he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "I can't lose respect now." Abby didn't know how to respond. To her, it seemed Christopher wasn't just trying to protect his reputation but was also hiding a vulnerability that consumed him. Evelyn, on the other hand, wasn't done playing her game. She knew she had shaken Christopher, and she enjoyed it. To her, the wedding wasn't just a celebration of her new beginning. It was an opportunity to remind Christopher that she had moved on. And now, news of Abby's impressive performance was spreading among the elite. Evelyn couldn't decide whether to see Abby as a threat or as an intriguing piece on the chessboard. She decided it was time to learn more about her, arranging a casual meeting under the pretense of getting to know Christopher's new company. Meanwhile, Abby began receiving unexpected support from James, Evelyn's younger brother. He was different from her, less focused on manipulation and more interested in authenticity. "You have something they don't," James said during a casual conversation. "They play to win, but you play to be honest." Abby wasn't entirely sure how to interpret this, but his support made her feel that maybe there was a place for her in this world without having to change who she was. Christopher, however, didn't take kindly to the growing closeness between Abby and James, though he couldn't quite explain why. Evelyn's provocations, now aimed at both Abby and Christopher, began to intensify the tension. She knew exactly where to strike, questioning Abby's position in their world and Christopher's vulnerability. During a social event, Evelyn made a cutting remark about Abby. "You must feel out of place, dear. But that's normal when you're out of your element." Abby, though hurt, replied firmly, "Maybe I am, but at least I don't have to hide who I am to fit in." Christopher felt a mix of pride and guilt as he heard her response. Abby started to question her own intentions. Why was she letting Evelyn get to her? And why did she feel such a strong need to protect Christopher when he seemed incapable of protecting himself? These questions began to create an emotional barrier between her and Christopher. He, in turn, felt increasingly isolated. The pride that had once driven him now felt like a prison, and he didn't know how to break free. Conversations with Abby grew more tense, filled with unspoken emotions and subtle undertones. Christopher didn't want to admit it, but Abby's closeness with James bothered him more than it should. He began to observe them more closely, trying to mask the jealousy that didn't even make sense to him. Abby, on the other hand, noticed Christopher pulling away but couldn't understand why. The bond they had started to form seemed to be unraveling before it had a chance to solidify. Both were trapped in their own insecurities, unable to see the truth behind their feelings. Evelyn remained a constant presence, a shadow looming over everything. She knew exactly how to manipulate situations to keep Christopher on the defensive and Abby questioning her place. Yet, at the same time, Evelyn began to realize she might not have full control of the situation. Abby was more resilient than she appeared, and Christopher, despite his weaknesses, was starting to see through Evelyn's traps. The game was shifting, and no one could predict who would come out on top. Amid all this tension, Christopher made an impulsive decision. He needed to protect Abby, even if it meant pushing her away. "You don't belong in this world," he told her during a conversation in his office. Abby felt the blow but refused to cry. "Maybe I don't, but I thought you had started to see me differently," she replied. Christopher didn't know how to respond. He was losing more than he realized, but he still couldn't admit it to himself. And so, the cracks between them began to widen into chasms. Abby, hurt, decided she needed to focus on herself. Christopher, on the other hand, started to realize he might be fighting the wrong battle. But was it too late to fix things? Both were about to face their greatest trials, and the impact of their choices would change everything. The dismissal came as a shock to Abby. She had grown used to facing the barriers the elitist world threw her way, but nothing prepared her for Christopher's final blow. "You don't belong in this world," he had said, with the coldness of someone who believed they were doing the right thing. Abby felt a mix of anger and sadness as his words sank in. She thought about the nights spent preparing Evelyn's criticism and the effort she had put into proving she could face that challenge. And now, it all seemed to have been for nothing. Christopher believed he was protecting Abby by pushing her away, but deep down he knew he'd made a mistake. The way she challenged him, the way she saw through his masks, made him feel exposed. He wasn't ready to confront that vulnerability. It was easier to push her away, convincing himself it was for the best. But as he tried to move on, the emptiness he felt seemed to grow deeper. He might have millions of dollars, but he lacked the one thing that mattered most: someone who saw him for who he truly was. Determined to rebuild her life, Abby threw herself into a project she had tucked away in the back of her mind: sustainable urbanism. The idea stemmed from her passion for transforming urban spaces into accessible, functional places for communities. What started as a distraction quickly became a mission. She worked tirelessly, connecting with professionals in the field, learning about funding opportunities, and presenting her ideas at small conferences. With each step, Abby felt she was rediscovering her purpose, far away from the shadows of Christopher and Evelyn. While Abby thrived in her new endeavor, Christopher found himself plagued by doubt. He heard about Abby's growing success through colleagues and the news. She was gaining recognition for her innovative ideas, and it made him question his own choices. He had built an empire based on power and status, but Abby's work seemed to have something his lacked: purpose. With every new achievement of hers, Christopher felt their worlds drifting further apart, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. At an industry event, the two crossed paths by chance. Abby was presenting her project to a group of investors, and Christopher spotted her from across the room. He was taken aback by the confidence and passion she exuded, so different from the woman he had dismissed. When their eyes finally met, it was as if time stopped. Abby didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Christopher, on the other hand, felt a pang of regret. He knew he had to say something but had no idea how. After the event, Christopher approached her. "You're amazing," he said, almost in a whisper. Abby thanked him but kept her distance. "What do you want, Christopher?" she asked, her voice laced with distrust. He tried to explain that he had made a mistake in pushing her away, but Abby wasn't ready to forgive. "You saw me as nothing more than a piece in your game. I can't go back to that." Christopher realized that regaining her trust would be harder than he thought, but he was willing to try. Abby returned to her routine, but Christopher's words lingered in her mind. He seemed different, almost remorseful. Even so, she wasn't willing to give up the independence and success she had built for herself because of him. She had spent too much time being underestimated, and now, for the first time, she felt in control. But at the same time, something inside her suggested there might still be more to explore in their relationship, if he was truly willing to change. Christopher, on the other hand, was determined to prove he had changed. He started studying Abby's work, trying to understand what drove her. For the first time, he began to think about how he could use his resources for something beyond profit. Inspired by Abby, he began developing a project that would combine his company's reach with her ideas. He knew it would be difficult to convince Abby to trust him again, but he was ready to try, even if it meant setting aside his pride. When Christopher finally approached Abby with the proposal for a partnership, she hesitated. He seemed sincere, but she still had doubts. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, not bothering to hide her skepticism. Christopher took a deep breath before answering. "Because you showed me something I'd never seen before, that money isn't everything. I want to do something that matters, and I want to do it with you." Abby didn't respond immediately. She needed time to decide if she was ready to give him a second chance. Abby finally gave her answer. "I'll do it, but under my conditions," she said firmly, meeting Christopher in a conference room that looked more like a modern art installation. He stared at her for a moment, surprised by her stance. The woman standing before him was a transformed version of the Abby he once knew, and it left him unsettled. "What conditions?" he asked, crossing his arms. Abby gave a faint smile, but her voice remained steady. "The project needs to be about real impact, not just profit. And if you're not fully committed, don't even bother starting." Christopher felt the weight of her words and, for the first time, hesitated before responding. The work began under palpable tension. Christopher struggled to let go of his old habits of control and ego, but it wasn't easy. Abby, on the other hand, wrestled with trusting him. Every meeting was a battle, every decision a test of patience. Yet, slowly they started to find a rhythm. Abby was surprised to see Christopher genuinely listening to her ideas and considering her perspectives. He, in turn, was learning that vulnerability wasn't synonymous with weakness. But that didn't mean the road ahead would be smooth. As the project began to take shape, the criticism started rolling in. Shareholders from Christopher's company questioned the changes. "This will cost us millions," one argued in a heated meeting. Christopher, who would have once backed down to maintain the board's support, surprised everyone by defending Abby and the project with conviction. "We're building something bigger than a bank balance. We're building a legacy." Hearing this, Abby felt something shift inside her. Maybe he was changing after all. Despite their progress, Evelyn resurfaced as a shadow from the past, this time to shake the foundation of the new venture. She caught wind of the project and found a way to undermine it, spreading rumors that it was nothing more than a shallow marketing ploy. Abby was furious, but Christopher appeared calm. "She's testing my patience, but I won't stoop to her level," he said. Abby wasn't so sure. Watching him deal with Evelyn again made her question whether he was truly ready to move on, or if she was allowing herself to fall into another emotional trap. The turning point came when a major investor threatened to withdraw their support unless the project was altered to prioritize more lucrative interests. Christopher faced a dilemma that could dismantle everything they had built: give in to secure funding or stick to the project's original purpose. Abby made her stance clear. "If you back down now, you're telling everyone that money still controls you." Her words echoed in Christopher's mind. He knew this was his chance to prove he was capable of more, but the risk felt enormous. Christopher finally made his decision. At a press conference organized to address the rumors surrounding the project, he spoke with a sincerity that shocked everyone. "For too long, I've let money dictate who I am and what I do. But thanks to people like Abby, I've learned that true value isn't measured in figures." Abby, watching from the audience, felt her eyes fill with tears. For the first time, she believed he was truly changing. And more importantly, she realized she had played a part in making that happen. Christopher's speech marked a turning point for the project. Although they lost some major investors, the media attention brought in new supporters eager to create positive impact. Abby and Christopher began working together with more synergy than ever. Every obstacle seemed to strengthen their partnership, but both still carried wounds from the past that needed healing. Christopher felt there was something he needed to say to Abby but struggled to find the right words. As the project gained traction, Abby found herself growing closer to Christopher again in a way that scared her. She knew he was changing, but she was still afraid of getting hurt. Christopher, meanwhile, realized that his admiration for Abby had deepened into something far more profound. He knew he would have to be honest with her about his feelings, but he also knew he needed to be patient. Abby wasn't someone who trusted easily, and he wanted to prove he was worthy of that trust. The project's success was a milestone for both of them, but the real impact was only beginning. They were changing not just the industry but also how they saw themselves and each other. The tension between them, now infused with respect and admiration, still left questions unanswered. How far could this partnership take them? And would they be willing to let go of their fears to find out? With the project finally taking off, Abby and Christopher began to realize they had created something much bigger than they had expected. The impact of their ideas was visible. Neglected urban spaces were now coming to life, connecting people and transforming communities. Each victory was shared with the team, but something else was growing between them. Their exchanged glances lingered longer, their conversations became more personal. Abby began to let her guard down, and Christopher, for the first time, felt he could be himself without fear of judgment. Christopher's dedication to the project's purpose continued to surprise Abby. He wasn't just defending her ideas, he was actively seeking ways to expand them. "You've taught me what real impact means," he said during a meeting where they were reviewing results. Abby smiled but kept a measure of emotional distance. As much as Christopher was showing signs of change, she knew trust was something built over time. Even so, every action of his seemed to spark a small glimmer of hope. However, their growing closeness brought new challenges. During an event celebrating the project, Christopher gave a speech that moved everyone in attendance. He spoke about past mistakes and how he had learned to value people, not just results. At the end of his speech, he looked directly at Abby and said, "Sometimes, it's the people we least expect who show us the way." The room erupted in applause, but Abby felt her heart race. She knew those words were meant for her, but what was she supposed to do with them? Christopher decided to take a bigger step. He approached Abby during a quiet moment, away from the chaos of meetings and events. "I want you to know how much you mean to me," he began hesitantly. Abby tried to keep her composure, but there was a tremor in her voice. "You've said that before, Christopher. Now show me." He was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. Abby didn't want empty promises. She wanted actions that proved he was committed not just to the project but to something greater. The turning point came during a shareholder meeting. A conservative proposal was presented, one that would compromise the project's values in exchange for higher profits. Christopher didn't hesitate to reject it, even knowing it would spark resistance. "I won't betray what we've built," he declared, looking directly at Abby. She felt the weight of his words, as if they were both an apology and a promise. For the first time, she began to believe he was willing to see this through to the end. As the project's success grew, Abby finally allowed herself to acknowledge her own feelings. She realized that, despite everything, Christopher had changed. He was no longer the man obsessed with pride and control she had first met. During a late-night conversation while reviewing a report together, Abby finally admitted, "I never thought I'd trust you, but you're proving me wrong." Christopher smiled, but his expression was serious. "I'm just trying to be someone you find worthy." Their partnership reached a new level. It was no longer just about work, it was about a connection that was transforming them both. Christopher began to feel lighter, as if he had finally let go of the weight he had been carrying for years. Abby, in turn, felt she had discovered not only a professional purpose but also a strength within herself she had never recognized. Together, they were creating something that reflected the best of both of them, and it was more rewarding than any individual success. But there was still something unresolved: the future. They knew they were changing, but what would that mean for their relationship? Christopher felt ready to confess his feelings but didn't want to rush Abby. She, on the other hand, wrestled with the fear of getting hurt and the desire to trust him fully. It was a delicate dance, where every step had to be taken with care. While planning the next phase of the project, an unexpected opportunity arose: an invitation to present their sustainable urbanism model at an international conference. It was the kind of recognition they had both been striving for, but what mattered most was that they would be going together. The trip promised to be a milestone not only in their careers but also in their lives. Both of them felt that something was about to change, and perhaps, at last, they were ready to face whatever came next together. And so, with their bags packed and their hearts full of anticipation, Christopher and Abby embarked on a new journey. They didn't know exactly where it would take them, but for the first time, they were both willing to find out. The international conference was a spectacle. Held in a vibrant, cosmopolitan city, it brought together leaders, innovators, and thinkers shaping the future of countless industries. For Christopher and Abby, it was more than a professional event. It was a stage to showcase the impact of their work and cement their reputations as visionaries in sustainable urbanism. But while everything appeared perfect on the surface, unresolved tension simmered beneath. The closeness brought by the trip only amplified the feelings they both hesitated to admit. Abby's speech was the most anticipated moment of the conference. When she stepped onto the stage, Christopher felt an unexpected wave of pride. As she spoke passionately about their project and its importance for marginalized communities, he realized Abby had become more than just a professional partner. She was the reason he had changed. When the audience erupted into applause, Christopher was the first to stand, clapping as if he couldn't contain what he felt. After the event, Christopher found Abby on the hotel terrace, gazing at the city lights. She stood in thought, wrapped in the cool night breeze. "You were incredible today," he said, approaching slowly. Abby smiled, but there was something in her expression that made him pause. "It's strange," she began, "how we can transform the world out there but still not figure out what we feel in here." Christopher knew exactly what she meant, but he was still struggling to find the right words. The silence between them was heavy, yet not uncomfortable. Finally, Christopher spoke. "I never thought I'd be here, in this position. You've changed my life, Abby. You've shown me there are things more important than money or pride." Abby felt his words land softly but hesitated nonetheless. "I want to believe that," she said, her voice steady. "But you need to prove that this change isn't just temporary." Christopher nodded, understanding that the only way to truly regain her trust was through action. In the days that followed, the two continued working side by side, but something had shifted. Christopher seemed more open, more willing to listen and share. Abby, in turn, began to lower her defenses, allowing small moments of connection to grow between them. Yet both knew they were treading fragile ground. It felt as though they were walking a thin bridge, trying to find balance between their past and the future they hoped to build together. The conference ended with an unexpected opportunity. A major investor expressed interest in replicating their sustainable urbanism model in other countries. It was a huge chance, but it also posed a challenge that would demand even more commitment and work. Christopher and Abby discussed the proposal over dinner, and it was then that she noticed something. "You're different, Christopher," she said, almost without thinking. He smiled, but not with the arrogance he once had. "And you've given me a reason to change," he replied. Abby felt the weight of his words and wondered if she was ready to embrace everything they meant. Back in their city, the success of the conference breathed new life into their project. Abby and Christopher began receiving invitations to events, meetings, and interviews. Their partnership was celebrated as an example of how the business world could transform into something more humane and meaningful. But they knew they couldn't keep putting off what was unresolved between them. They both deserved something real, but it would require courage. During an important presentation for new partners, Christopher did something he had never done before. While presenting the project's impact, he made a special acknowledgement of Abby. None of this would have been possible without the vision and strength of Abby Turner. "She's not just my partner in this project, she's the reason I believe we can do better, be better." The room erupted into applause, but Abby could barely process his words. It was a clear, public gesture, and she knew it was time to decide if she was ready to believe in him. Later that day, Christopher sought Abby out in her office. "I don't want to run anymore," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've made mistakes, but you've shown me I can be more than I was. And now I need to know, are you willing to give me a chance?" Abby was silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she replied, "I don't know what will happen, Christopher, but I think we can figure it out together." It was simple, but it was enough for both of them. The road ahead wasn't just about professional advancements or public accomplishments. It was about the personal transformation of two people who, in different ways, had learned to overcome the barriers they had built within themselves. Together, Christopher and Abby were ready to move forward, not as two separate worlds trying to coexist, but as one, driven by respect and truth. Christopher's speech continued to echo throughout the business world. He had positioned himself not just as a businessman, but as someone willing to fight for something bigger than his own pride. Abby, in turn, realized that the gesture wasn't just about the project or impressing others. It was about proving to her, and to himself, that his transformation was real. But the true test was still to come, and they both knew it. A new proposal arrived at the office: to expand the sustainable urbanism model to underserved communities with limited resources and political challenges. It was the kind of project that would intimidate even the most experienced professionals, but Abby saw it as an opportunity. "This is what it's all about, Christopher. Doing something that really matters," she said, her eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. Christopher, however, understood the magnitude of the challenge. There would be resistance, even from his own company's shareholders. He wondered if he was truly ready to face yet another battle. The resistance came in full force. During a board meeting, the arguments were harsh. "This will cost us far more than we can recover," one member said. Another added, "We're here to make a profit, not play philanthropy." Christopher glanced at Abby, who was seated beside him, and felt his determination renewed. "We're here to make a difference," he responded firmly. "And if that means redefining how we measure success, so be it." The silence that followed was heavy but meaningful. Christopher had made it clear that he would not back down. Abby was impressed by Christopher's courage but knew that victory in the boardroom was just the beginning. Practical and emotional difficulties lay ahead, and they would need to work as a true team to overcome them. During a walk after the meeting, she finally said, "I believe in you now, Christopher. But that doesn't mean it'll be easy." He smiled, a mix of relief and determination in his expression. "I don't want it to be easy. I want it to be right." It was the first time he had spoken so openly, and Abby felt like she was seeing the real Christopher. As the project took shape, the challenges became even more evident. Problems with suppliers, tense negotiations with local governments, and delays began to test everyone's patience. Abby, who had always kept her head high, started to feel the weight of the responsibility. Christopher noticed and, instead of pressuring her, did something she didn't expect. He delegated part of the workload and insisted that she take time for herself. "There's no point in building something incredible if you're breaking down in the process," he said, his tone filled with genuine concern. Christopher's approach did not go unnoticed by Abby. He was showing, through actions, that he was learning to value people's well-being as much as the results. It was a change she never thought she'd see in the man she'd met months earlier. Despite the difficulties, they continued to push forward, growing closer with each step. The project was no longer just a professional challenge. It had become a metaphor for their own journeys of transformation. Both were growing, not just as work partners but as individuals. The defining moment came during the opening of the first revitalized space. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. Children ran through newly refurbished playgrounds, families gathered in once abandoned areas, and a sense of hope filled the air. Christopher and Abby stood side by side, watching it all from a distance, saying nothing for several minutes. Finally, Christopher broke the silence. "We did this." Abby corrected him. "They did this. We just helped." He smiled, realizing she was right. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of success. But Christopher's complete resurrection happened there, in a simple yet profoundly significant gesture. During an interview with the local press, he was asked what had motivated his transformation. Without hesitation, he replied, "It was Abby. She showed me that money can open doors, but it's people who make the difference. And I wanted to be one of those people." Abby, listening from a distance, felt an emotion she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just pride, it was a mutual acknowledgement of everything they had built together. The day ended with an intimate conversation between the two under the soft lights of the revitalized space. "You really have changed, Christopher," Abby said with a gentle smile. "But the biggest change is that now I believe you were always capable of this." He laughed, almost relieved. "You gave me the chance to discover that, Abby. And for that, I'll always be grateful." It was a moment of redemption for both of them, a confirmation that the journey had been worth it. The project had transformed communities, but it had also transformed lives, most notably those of Christopher and Abby. They had emerged from their journeys as completely different people, with new priorities, values, and a deep mutual respect. But the elixir they carried back wasn't just the success of their work. It was what they had learned from each other: empathy, purpose, and above all, the strength to move forward even in the face of adversity. Christopher, now a name respected not only for his financial power but also for his social vision, decided to change his company's approach. He restructured departments, hired experts committed to real causes, and invested in initiatives he would never have considered before. "This is just the beginning," he told his team during a meeting. Abby, watching closely, felt a mix of pride and admiration. Seeing Christopher let go of ego and greed to build something more meaningful was the ultimate proof that he had been reborn. Meanwhile, Abby was experiencing her own transformation. Once an assistant seeking a foothold, she was now a recognized figure in her field, invited to events and projects around the world. She had learned to balance her newfound confidence with her humble and practical essence, something that made her stand out in a world where authenticity was rare. But even with so many opportunities, she chose to remain by Christopher's side, continuing the partnership that had started so turbulently but had become a cornerstone of her life. Their relationship also evolved. It was no longer marked by mistrust or initial tension but by a genuine connection. During a dinner at a small restaurant they had discovered together, Christopher finally said what he had been holding back for so long. "Abby, you're the person who made me believe I could be more. I want us to build something not just in work but in life." Abby, ever pragmatic, laughed. "I've been waiting for you to say that for weeks." But her smile revealed just how deeply his words had touched her. Together, Christopher and Abby began to plan their future, both personally and professionally. This new phase of their lives was filled with challenges but also supported by a strong partnership that left no doubt about what they could achieve. They learned to balance work and personal life, finding time to celebrate the small victories as much as the big ones. For them, what mattered was the journey, not just the results. The impact of their partnership began to inspire others. Companies adopted similar models, Influenced by Christopher's bold decision to shift his organization's focus and Abby's passion for creating real impact. In interviews and at events, they always highlighted the importance of teamwork and empathy, becoming a symbol of how business could go beyond profit. But for them, the greatest success was personal, the fact that they had found not just a partner but a home in each other. What started as a wager to prove something to the world had transformed into something that proved the value of vulnerability and mutual respect. Christopher and Abby hadn't just helped transform communities. They had shown that true impact begins within. The pride that had once driven Christopher was replaced by purpose, and Abby's insecurity had been turned into strength. Together, they were living proof that the best stories of triumph are the ones shared. In the end, the Chilixert they carried was much more than success or money. It was the certainty that they had found something greater, the chance to make a difference in the world while building a relationship founded on truth and growth. Under the lights of yet another community project inauguration, Christopher took Abby's hand, and both knew they were exactly where they were meant to be.